Chapter 27, Part 2 of The Virginian. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Virginian by Owen Wister. Chapter 27, Grandmother Stark, Part 2. So the two nurses continued to sit until darkness at the windows weakened into gray, and the lamp was no more needed. Their patient was rambling again. Yet into whatever scenes he went, there in some guise did the throb of his pain evidently follow him, and he lay hitching his great shoulder as if to rid it of the cumbrance. They waited for the doctor, not daring much more than to turn pillows and give what other ease they could. And then, instead of the doctor, came a messenger, about noon, to say he was gone on a visit some 30 miles beyond, where Taylor had followed to bring him here as soon as might be. At this Molly consented to rest, and to watch turnabout; and once she was over in her friend's house lying down, they tried to keep her there. But the revolutionist could not be put down, and when, as a last pretext, Mrs. Taylor urged the proprieties and conventions, the pale girl from Vermont laughed sweetly in her face, and returned to sit by the sick man. With the approach of the second night, his fever seemed to rise and master him more completely than they had yet seen it; and presently it so raged that the women called in stronger arms to hold him down. There were times when he broke out in the language of the round-up, and Mrs. Taylor renewed her protests. "Why," said Molly, "don't you suppose I knew they could swear?" So the dame, in deepening astonishment and affection, gave up these shifts at decorum. Nor did the delirium run into the intimate coarse matters that she dreaded. The cow puncher had lived like his kind, but his natural daily thoughts were clean, and came from the untamed but unstained mind of a man. And toward morning, as Mrs. Taylor sat taking her turn, suddenly he asked had he been sick long, and looked at her with a quieted eye. The wandering seemed to drop from him at a stroke, leaving him altogether himself. He lay very feeble, and inquired once or twice of his state and how he came here, nor was anything left in his memory of even coming to the spring where he had been found. When the doctor arrived, he pronounced that it would be long, or very short. He praised their clean water treatment. The wound was fortunately well up on the shoulder, and gave so far no bad signs. There were not any bad signs, and the blood and strength of the patient had been as few men's were. Each hour was now an hour nearer certainty, and meanwhile the doctor would remain as long as he could. He had many inquiries to satisfy. Dusty fellows would ride up, listen to him, and reply, as they rode away, "Don't yu let him die, Doc." And Judge Henry sent over from Sunk Creek to answer for any attendance or medicine that might help his foreman. The country was moved with concern and interest, and in Molly's ears its words of good feeling seemed to unite and sum up a burden. "Don't yu let him die, Doc." The Indians who had done this were now in military custody. They had come unpermitted from a southern reservation, hunting, next thieving, and as the slumbering spirit roused in one or two of the young and ambitious, they had ventured this in the secret mountains, and perhaps had killed a trapper found there. Editors immediately reared a tall war out of it, but from 5 Indians in a guardhouse waiting punishment, not even an editor can supply spar for more than 2 editions. And if the recent alarm was still a matter of talk anywhere, it was not here in the sick room. Whichever way the case should turn, it was through Molly alone, the doctor told her, that the wounded man had got this chance, this good chance, he related. And he told her she had not done a woman's part, but a man's part, and now had no more to do. No more till the patient got well and could thank her in his own way, said the doctor, smiling, and supposing things that were not so, misled perhaps by Mrs. Taylor. "I'm afraid I'll be gone by the time he is well," said Molly coldly, and the discreet physician said ah, and that she would find Bennington quite a change from Bear Creek. But Mrs. Taylor spoke otherwise, and at that the girl said, "I shall stay as long as I am needed. I will nurse him. I want to nurse him. I will do everything for him that I can," she exclaimed with force. "And that won't be anything, dearie," said Mrs. Taylor harshly. "A year of nursing don't equal a day of sweetheart." The girl took a walk. She was of no more service in the room at present. But she turned without going far, and Mrs. Taylor spied her come to lean over the pasture fence and watch the two horses, that one the Virginian had gentled for her, and his own Monte. During this suspense came a new call for the doctor, neighbors profiting by his visit to Bear Creek. And in his going away to them, even under promise of quick return, Mrs. Taylor suspected a favorable sign. He kept his word as punctually as had been possible, arriving after some 6 hours with a confident face, and spending now upon the patient a care not needed, save to reassure the bystanders. He spoke his opinion that all was even better than he could have hoped it would be, so soon. Here was now the beginning of the 5th day. The wound's look was wholesome, no further delirium had come, and the fever had abated a degree while he was absent. He believed the serious danger line lay behind, and, short of the unforeseen, the man's deep untainted strength would reassert its control. He had much blood to make, and must be cared for during weeks, 3, 4, 5, there was no saying how long yet. These next few days it must be utter quiet for him. He must not talk, nor hear anything likely to disturb him. And then the time for cheerfulness and gradual company would come, sooner than later, the doctor hoped. So he departed, and sent next day some bottles, with further cautions regarding the wound and dirt, and to say he should be calling the day after tomorrow. Upon that occasion he found 2 patients. Molly Wood lay in bed at Mrs. Taylor's, filled with apology and indignation. With little to do, and deprived of the strong stimulant of anxiety and action, her strength had quite suddenly left her, so that she had spoken only in a sort of whisper. But upon waking from a long sleep, after Mrs. Taylor had taken her firmly, almost severely, in hand, her natural voice had returned, and now the chief treatment the doctor gave her was a sort of scolding, which it pleased Mrs. Taylor to hear. The doctor even dropped a phrase concerning the arrogance of strong nerves in slender bodies, and of undertaking several people's work when several people were at hand to do it for themselves, and this pleased Mrs. Taylor remarkably. As for the wounded man, he was behaving himself properly. Perhaps in another week he could be moved to a more cheerful room. Just now, with cleanliness and pure air, any barn would do. "We are real lucky to have such a sensible doctor in the country," Mrs. Taylor observed after the physician had gone. "No doubt," said Molly. "He said my room was a barn." "That's what you've made it, dearie. But sick men don't notice much." Nevertheless, one may believe, without going widely astray, that illness, so far from veiling, more often quickens the perceptions, at any rate those of the naturally keen. On a later day, and the interval was brief, while Molly was on her second drive to take the air with Mrs. Taylor, that lady informed her that the sick man had noticed. "And I could not tell him things liable to disturb him," said she. "And so I expect I just didn't exactly tell him the facts. I said, yes, you were packing up for a little visit to your folks. They had not seen you for quite a while, I said, and he looked at those boxes kind of silent like." "There's no need to move him," said Molly. "It is simpler to move them, the boxes. I could take out some of my things, you know, just while he has to be kept there. I mean, you see, if the doctor says the room should be cheerful." "Yes, dearie." "I will ask the doctor next time," said Molly, "if he believes I am competent to spread a rug upon a floor.